A legion of Harpy women snatched me into the sky, and their queen demanded I bear their future. I never believed in monsters until talons pierced through my shoulders and ripped me from the earth. One moment, I was walking home through the park after my shift at the warehouse, headphones drowning out the world, and the next I was screaming as enormous wings beat against my face and powerful clawed feet dug into my flesh. The ground fell away so fast my stomach lurched into my throat. I looked up into eyes that burned like molten gold, set in a face that was simultaneously beautiful and terrible. She was a woman from the neck down mostly, her body covered in bronze feathers that caught the dying sunlight, but her feet were massive talons, and her arms ended in wing-like appendages tipped with razor claws. Her face was angular, almost avian, with a sharp nose and lips that pulled back to reveal teeth too pointed to be human. She shrieked at me, a sound that was half human scream and half bird of prey, and I felt my bladder nearly give out from pure terror. Around us, dozens more of these creatures filled the sky. They circled in formation, their shadows racing across the buildings below as rush hour traffic became a distant memory. Some carried bundles in their talons that I realized with horror were other people, all men, all struggling and screaming. The Harpy holding me adjusted her grip, and I cried out as her claws dug deeper, warm blood running down my chest and soaking my shirt. She hissed something in a language that sounded like wind through canyon rocks, and the others responded with their own harsh calls. We were climbing higher, the city shrinking beneath us until cars looked like insects, and people disappeared entirely. The air grew thin and cold. My ears popped. I couldn't breathe properly. Black spots danced in my vision, and I thought I might pass out, which honestly seemed preferable to whatever was about to happen. The flight felt endless. My arms hung useless at my sides, numb from the awkward angle and the pressure on my shoulders. The Harpy's breathing was steady and powerful, her chest rising and falling with each massive beat of her wings. I could smell her, a strange mixture of wind and sage and something musky and animal. Below us, the landscape changed from city to suburbs to farmland to wilderness. Mountains rose in the distance, jagged peaks that seemed to scrape the sky. We were heading straight for them. As we drew closer, I saw that the mountains were honeycombed with caves, and from those caves emerged more harpies. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They filled the air like a swarm, their cries echoing off the stone until it sounded like the mountain itself was screaming. We descended toward a massive opening near the summit, a cave mouth easily 50 feet high and twice as wide. Inside, the space opened into a cathedral of stone, lit by what seemed to be thousands of bioluminescent fungi growing along the walls in swirling patterns. The Harpy released me, and I hit the ground hard, crying out as pain shot through my knees and palms. All around me, other men were being dropped, some landing better than I did, others not so lucky. I counted maybe 30 of us in total. We were in what looked like a natural amphitheater, circular and sloping downward toward a raised platform of smooth stone at the center. On that platform stood a Harpy unlike any of the others. She was easily 8 feet tall, her wings so massive they cast shadows that covered half the space. Her feathers were not bronze, but a deep crimson that seemed to glow in the fungal light, and her eyes were not gold but silver, cold and calculating. She wore what could only be described as armor made from bones and leather, covering her torso and hips, and around her neck hung a collar of what I prayed were animal skulls, but feared were something else entirely. The queen, because she could only be a queen, raised one wing, and the cavern fell silent, except for the sobbing and heavy breathing of us captive men. When she spoke, her voice carried the same harsh quality as the others, but with an underlying resonance that made my bones vibrate. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood the tone, command, absolute, and unquestionable. The Harpies that had brought us landed in tiers around the amphitheater, hundreds of eyes watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The queen gestured, and one of the Harpies, smaller than the others and with feathers of pale gray, stepped forward and began to speak. Her voice was halting, as if the sounds of human language were difficult for her throat to produce, but understandable. She said the queen welcomed us to the Eyrie, the sacred home of the Harpy clans, and that we had been chosen for a great honor. The way she said honor made it sound more like a death sentence. The gray Harpy explained that their species was dying. For generations, they had only been able to produce female offspring. Their males had disappeared centuries ago, victims of a curse laid upon them by an enemy whose name had been lost to time. They had tried everything to break the curse. They had sought out sorcerers and shamans, had performed rituals that required sacrifices I didn't want to think about, had searched ancient texts written in languages older than civilization. Nothing worked. Each generation produced only daughters, and while harpies were long-lived, they were not immortal. Their numbers had been slowly declining for 300 years. Now, the queen had discovered something in an old prophecy, something that suggested human men, if properly integrated into their society, might be able to father male harpy offspring. We were the test subjects. We were to be kept here, studied, assessed, and eventually bred with harpy females to see if the prophecy held true. The casual way she said bred, as if we were livestock, made several of the men start screaming. Guards swooped down and silenced them with quick strikes that left them unconscious but breathing. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cave entrance was behind ranks of harpy warriors, and even if I could somehow get past them, we were thousands of feet up a sheer mountain face. I looked around at the other men. Some were crying, some were in shock, staring at nothing. A few looked angry, defiant, but that defiance would do them no good here. We were trapped. The queen made another gesture, and we were herded deeper into the cave system, through tunnels that twisted and turned, until I lost all sense of direction. We emerged in a large chamber with smaller alcoves carved into the walls, each alcove containing a nest of woven branches and soft materials that might have been fur, or might have been something else. This was to be our holding area. Food was brought, chunks of roasted meat that I couldn't identify, and fruits I'd never seen before. I was starving, but my stomach rebelled at the thought of eating. Still, survival instinct won out, and I forced down some fruit. It tasted like nothing I'd ever had, sweet and tart simultaneously, with a texture like velvet. Over the following days, I learned the brutal reality of our situation. We were divided into groups based on some criteria I couldn't discern. Some men were taken away and didn't return. Others came back shaking, traumatized, refusing to speak about what had happened to them. I was in a group that seemed to be undergoing observation. Harpies would come and study us, taking measurements with tools I didn't understand, asking questions through translators about our health, our families, our lives before. They seemed particularly interested in men who showed less fear, who adapted more quickly to captivity. I tried to play the middle ground, not too submissive but not rebellious enough to warrant punishment. I watched and learned. The Harpy society was complex, far more sophisticated than I would have guessed. They had a caste system based on feather color and wing size. The crimson-feathered were nobility, warriors, and leaders. Bronze, like most of our captors, were the worker class, hunters and builders. The gray-feathered were scholars and translators. There were others too, blacks who seemed to handle the dead, whites who tended the luminescent fungi that provided light, and rare individuals with multicolored plumage who served as advisors to the queen. I learned that their mountain, which they called the Spire of Winds, was considered sacred ground, a place where the sky itself was born according to their mythology. They believed they were the children of the storm, created by the first lightning strike to ever touch the earth. Their religion was brutal and beautiful in equal measure, full of rituals involving flight and sacrifice, and the honoring of air currents as if they were gods. I watched from my alcove as they performed ceremonies at dawn, hundreds of harpies launching themselves from the mountain in synchronized formations, their songs echoing across the peaks in harmonies that, despite everything, made my throat tight with unexpected emotion. They were monsters who had stolen me from my life, but they were also something more, something ancient and magnificent and terribly sad in their slow extinction. The queen summoned me on the 18th day. I was taken from the holding chamber by 2 crimson-feathered guards and led through passages I'd never seen before, up and up until we emerged in a space at the very peak of the mountain. The chamber was open to the sky on one side, and the view was breathtaking. I could see for hundreds of miles in every direction, forests and rivers and distant cities that looked like toys. The queen stood at the edge, her massive wings spread wide, catching the wind. She turned when I entered and studied me with those unnerving silver eyes. When she spoke, it was without a translator, her voice struggling with human words, but managing them nonetheless. She asked me if I understood why I was here. I said I understood I was a prisoner, a potential breeding animal for her dying species. She made a sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been a threat. She said I was more than that. She said the prophecy spoke of a human who would not just father male offspring, but would bridge the gap between their world and mine, who would teach them what they had forgotten in their isolation. She said she had watched me, seen how I observed, how I learned, how I didn't break even when others had. She said I had been chosen not just as a potential father, but as a candidate for something greater. The queen explained that Harpy culture had once been different. Long ago, before the curse, they had lived alongside humans, trading and sharing knowledge. Human men would sometimes marry into Harpy clans, and Harpy women would sometimes choose to live in human settlements. It was a time of peace and mutual benefit. Then the curse came. The males died, and in their grief and rage, the Harpies retreated to the mountains and became what they were now, isolated, desperate, and increasingly savage. The queen wanted to restore that old way, but to do so required trust, and trust required someone willing to be the first to stand between two worlds. She asked if I would be that person. I asked what happened if I refused. She said nothing for a long moment, then told me that refusal was not an option I had, but how I approached my role, with defiance or with cooperation, would determine not just my fate, but the fate of every man here, and every Harpy hoping for survival. It was a choice that wasn't a choice, but she was at least being honest about it. I was given a new chamber, larger and more comfortable, with actual furniture carved from wood and stone. I was assigned a personal guard, a bronze-feathered Harpy named Kestrel, who spoke better human language than most. She was young for their kind, maybe equivalent to early 20s in human terms, and she seemed curious about me rather than hostile. Through her, I began to truly learn about their world. She taught me their language, starting with basic words and phrases. She explained the intricacies of their caste system, how a Harpy's color was determined at birth by a combination of lineage and something they called wind blessing, a mystical concept I couldn't quite grasp. She told me about the curse in more detail, how one day the males simply started dying, falling from the sky mid-flight, as if struck by invisible arrows. Within a month, every male Harpy was dead. The females had been left alone, confused and terrified, and in the centuries since, their society had adapted but never recovered. Kestrel showed me the nursery levels, vast chambers where eggs were kept warm by geothermal vents running through the mountain. I saw hundreds of eggs, all different sizes and patterns, each one representing a future female Harpy and another generation without males. The females who tended the eggs sang to them constantly, lullabies that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. Some of the eggs were cracked and empty, and Kestrel explained that not all eggs hatched successfully. Their population was declining faster now than ever before. In another century, maybe less, there would be no more Harpies. The desperation in her voice when she said that made me realize that despite their power and their predatory nature, they were terrified. They were watching their entire species march toward extinction, and were willing to try anything, even kidnapping humans, to prevent it. I was introduced to the scholars, the gray-feathered ones, who had been studying the prophecy for decades. They showed me the text, carved into a stone tablet so old it was almost impossible to read. The language was Proto-Harpy, something that predated their current tongue, and only a few could still translate it. The prophecy was vague, as prophecies always are, speaking of skyborn and earthborn joining, of blood mixed with wind, of a bridge built from necessity and maintained through sacrifice. It mentioned a human male who would dream in feathers, whatever that meant, and whose offspring would carry both talons and hands. The scholars debated endlessly about interpretation. Some believed it meant literal crossbreeding. Others thought it was metaphorical, about cultural integration. A few believed it was a warning rather than a solution, that attempting to mix species would only accelerate their doom. The queen had chosen to interpret it as permission to proceed, and what the queen commanded was law. I was brought to meet potential mates. This was as awkward and horrifying as it sounds. Harpy females of appropriate age and status were paraded before me in a ceremonial chamber while I stood there feeling like a prize bull at auction. Some of them looked at me with curiosity, others with disdain, a few with something that might have been hunger. I was told I would not be forced to mate immediately, that there would be a period of acclimation, but the expectation was clear. I would perform this duty, or my comfortable situation would change dramatically. That night, I lay in my chamber staring at the stone ceiling and wondering if I had lost my mind. Part of me kept expecting to wake up in my apartment, to find this had all been some bizarre nightmare brought on by bad food or stress. But I didn't wake up. The dawn came, and with it the songs of Harpies greeting the sun, and I was still here, still trapped, still facing an impossible situation. Kestrel became something like a friend, though I was never sure if her kindness was genuine or part of her assignment. She told me about her own life, how she had been hatched from an egg 30 years ago, though she looked much younger. Harpies age differently, maturing quickly, then remaining in their prime for centuries, before a relatively short decline. She had never known a male of her own kind, had only heard stories from the elders about what they were like. She asked me questions about human men, about human relationships and families and love. The concept of romantic love seemed foreign to her. Harpies mated pragmatically, choosing partners based on genetics and compatibility rather than emotion. The idea that humans bonded for life based on feelings fascinated and confused her. She asked if I had someone waiting for me back home. I told her about Sarah, the woman I'd been seeing for 6 months. We weren't serious, not yet, but there had been potential. Now she probably thought I was dead. Everyone probably thought I was dead. The police would have investigated my disappearance, would have found nothing, and eventually the case would go cold. My life was over, even if I somehow escaped. Escape became an obsession for the other men. I heard them talking in whispers, planning impossible schemes. Some thought they could fashion weapons and fight their way out. Others thought they could climb down the mountain under cover of darkness. A few had given up entirely and simply waited for whatever fate the Harpies had planned. I considered joining one of the escape plots, but something held me back. Maybe it was cowardice, maybe it was pragmatism, but I couldn't see a way for any of those plans to succeed. We were too high up, too heavily guarded, and too deep in unfamiliar territory. Even if we made it out of the spire, where would we go? We were in mountains I didn't recognize, probably hundreds of miles from any human settlement. We'd die of exposure or starvation long before we found help. The Queen summoned me again on the 30th day. This time, the meeting was different. She was not alone. With her were 3 other Harpies, all crimson-feathered, all bearing the marks of high status. They were the clan leaders, the heads of the largest and most powerful Harpy families. Through a translator, the Queen explained that she was facing resistance to her plan. Many Harpies believed that mixing with humans was unnatural, that it would corrupt their bloodlines even if it did produce male offspring. Others feared that any males born from human fathers would be weak, unable to fly properly or lead their people. Still, others simply hated humans for past conflicts and saw us as enemies to be destroyed rather than partners to be embraced. The Queen was risking civil war by forcing this experiment forward, but she believed she had no choice. She told me that to convince the skeptics, she needed proof of concept. She needed me to successfully father a child with a Harpy female, and she needed that child to be male and healthy and strong. If I could do that, she could silence the opposition. If I couldn't, she would have no choice but to try more desperate measures. I was paired with a Harpy named Razorwing, a bronze-feathered huntress who made it clear from our first meeting that she found the entire situation distasteful but understood her duty to her people. She was blunt and cold, treating me like a necessary evil. Our interactions were clinical, supervised by scholars and healers who monitored everything. I won't describe the details because they're not mine to share, and because remembering them makes me feel more like an object than a person. What I will say is that the process was nothing like human intimacy. There was no warmth, no connection, just biological function performed with the detachment of a medical procedure. Afterward, I was returned to my chamber, and Razorwing went back to her own life, and we didn't speak again. The scholars told me it would be months before they knew if the attempt was successful, that Harpy gestation periods were long and complex. All I could do was wait. During the waiting, I was given more freedom. I was allowed to explore the spire under guard, to observe Harpy life in more detail. I saw their forges where they worked metal, pulled from deep mine shafts in the mountain's heart, shaping weapons and tools with surprising skill. I saw their agriculture levels where they grew the strange fruits and grains that made up part of their diet, cultivated in chambers warmed by volcanic heat. I saw their schools where young Harpies learned to fly, watched fledglings barely able to glide practice in massive vertical shafts until their wings grew strong enough for true flight. It was a complete society, sophisticated and functional, and it made me realize how wrong I'd been to think of them as simple monsters. They were people, just vastly different from humans, struggling to survive like any other people would. I also saw the darker sides of their culture. I witnessed punishment ceremonies where Harpies who had violated clan law were cast out, literally thrown from the mountain with their wings bound so they couldn't fly. I saw the butchering chambers where they prepared meat, and tried not to think too hard about what some of those carcasses might have been. I observed territorial disputes between clans that sometimes erupted into violence, mid-air battles that left wounded harpies falling to be caught by their sisters before they hit ground. Their world was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and I was trapped in the middle of it with no clear path forward. News came on the 67th day. Razorwing was pregnant. The scholars confirmed it through methods I didn't understand. Something about reading wind patterns around her body and examining her feathers for color changes. The news spread through the spire like wildfire. Harpies who had been hostile to me suddenly showed cautious respect. Others became more hostile, seeing the pregnancy as proof that their fears about corruption were founded. The queen was triumphant, declaring that this was the beginning of their salvation. But Razorwing herself seemed conflicted. When I saw her in a corridor a few days after the announcement, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between resentment and fear, and maybe curiosity. She said nothing, just spread her wings and flew away down a vertical shaft, leaving me to wonder what she was thinking. The pregnancy progressed differently than human pregnancy. Razorwing's body changed in ways the scholars found both encouraging and concerning. Her feathers took on a subtle pattern they'd never seen before, whirls of darker bronze that formed spirals across her wings. Her eyes, normally a golden amber, developed flecks of brown that the scholars said looked distinctly human. She grew larger, her body adapting to carry what they hoped would be a male child. The entire spire held its breath waiting. Other men were now being paired with harpy females, the queen having decided to accelerate the program based on the initial success. I heard screams sometimes from other parts of the mountain. Whether from the men or the harpies, I couldn't tell. Not everyone was handling the situation as clinically as Razorwing had. I was summoned to the queen again. She looked tired, I realized. Her feathers less lustrous than before, her movements slightly slower. The weight of leadership during this crisis was taking its toll. She told me that scouts had reported activity in the lowlands. Human search parties were coming closer to the mountain range, looking for the missing men. The harpies had avoided detection so far by staying high in the peaks, but it was only a matter of time before someone looked up at the right moment. The queen faced a dilemma. If humans discovered the spire, there would be war. Humans had guns and explosives and vehicles, technology far beyond what harpies possessed. The spire would fall, and every harpy would die. But if the queen ordered the scouts to eliminate the search parties, to kill humans to protect their secret, she would be starting a war herself. She asked me what I thought she should do. I was stunned that she was asking my opinion, but I realized she was desperate for perspective from someone who understood both worlds. I told her the truth, that humans would never stop searching, that the disappearances had created too much attention, and that eventually the spire would be found no matter what precautions they took. The only question was whether that discovery would be hostile or diplomatic. I suggested that maybe, instead of hiding, the harpies should reach out. That if they released some of the men, sent them back with proof of what was happening and an explanation of the harpy situation, there might be a chance for negotiation. Humans had wildlife preserves, endangered species programs, organizations dedicated to preventing extinction. Maybe, with the right approach, the two species could find a way forward that didn't involve kidnapping or war. The queen listened, her silver eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said that what I proposed would require immense trust on both sides, trust that centuries of isolation had eroded. She said she would consider it, but that I should understand that not all decisions were hers alone to make. The clan leaders held power too, and many of them would see my suggestion as weakness or betrayal. Months passed. Razorwing's pregnancy reached its final stage. The scholars became increasingly excited as they detected what they believed were signs of male development in the fetus. The way they explained it, male harpies had slightly different bone structures, different muscle attachments for their wings, different vocal chambers. They thought they could detect these differences even before birth. The entire spire seemed to hold its breath as Razorwing entered labor. It happened at night, signaled by her cry that echoed through every chamber. I was brought to the birthing room, a circular space at the mountain's heart, where heated rocks provided warmth and skilled midwives attended. Harpy birth was faster than human birth, violent and primal. Razorwing's screams merged with the encouraging calls of the midwives, and after what felt like hours but was probably less, the sound of an infant's cry filled the air. The midwives lifted the child and the room erupted in chaos. It was male. Unmistakably, definitely male, with the correct anatomy and the bone structure the scholars had hoped for. But he was also something else, something unexpected. His wings were smaller than a pure harpy's would be at birth, and his feet, while tipped with talons, were more human in proportion. His face was a blend of avian and human features, his eyes bright and alert, but somehow softer than a harpy's. His feathers were a color no one had ever seen, a deep auburn that caught the light like polished copper. The scholars examined him frantically, taking measurements and notes while Razorwing watched with exhausted eyes. After what felt like an eternity, the lead scholar turned to me and said something in their language. The translator looked shocked as she said, "He is perfect. He is the bridge made flesh. He is hope." The queen declared 7 days of celebration. For the first time in 3 centuries, a male had been born to the Harpy clans. That he was only half Harpy didn't matter to most. He was proof that the curse could be broken, that survival was possible. They named him Stormbringer, a name heavy with prophecy and expectation. I was allowed to hold him once, this tiny creature that was somehow my son, but also belonged to a species not my own. He looked at me with eyes that seemed too knowing for an infant, and made a sound that was half coo and half chirp. I felt something crack inside my chest. Some wall I'd been maintaining between myself and this impossible situation. This wasn't just an abstract problem anymore. This was a child, my child, and he was going to grow up in a world that I was realizing might be more complicated than I'd ever imagined. But not everyone was celebrating. The clan leader, called Red Talon, who commanded the largest faction of traditionalist harpies, declared the child an abomination. She said that mixing with humans was against the natural order, that Stormbringer was a corruption of Harpy purity, and that allowing him to live would doom them all, rather than save them. She called for the queen to be removed from power, and for the experiment to end immediately, with all human men either killed or released. The queen refused, and the spire found itself on the edge of civil war. Crimson-feathered warriors began choosing sides, and the air grew tense with the threat of violence. I was moved to a secure location deep in the mountain, guarded by loyalists who made it clear that if fighting broke out, I was both valuable hostage and potential casualty. The confrontation came on the 3rd day after Stormbringer's birth. Red Talon and her followers, numbering perhaps 200 harpies, gathered in the great amphitheater and demanded the queen step down. The queen, flanked by her own supporters, refused. What happened next was chaos. The 2 factions collided in midair, talons and wings and screams filling the vast space. I watched from my hiding place as harpies I'd come to recognize fought and bled and fell. The battle lasted for hours, neither side gaining clear advantage. Then Razorwing appeared, carrying Stormbringer, and flew into the center of the conflict. She screamed something in their language and both sides paused. She held her son high, this tiny half-human child, and spoke. I couldn't understand all of it, but Kestrel, who had stayed with me during the fighting, translated in whispers. Razorwing was saying that she had hated being chosen for this task, had hated me and the entire situation, but that when she looked at her son, she saw neither corruption nor abomination. She saw survival. She saw adaptation. She saw a species willing to change rather than die with pride intact. She said that 300 years ago, the curse had stolen their males, and instead of evolving, instead of finding new ways to exist, they had clung to old ways and blamed the world for their decline. She said Stormbringer was proof that they could change, could grow, could survive if they were brave enough to accept it. Her words turned the tide. Not completely, not everyone, but enough. Red Talon's support wavered. Some of her followers flew to the queen's side. Red Talon herself, seeing her power slipping away, made a choice that I think showed more honor than I expected. She acknowledged that the child's existence changed things, that perhaps the old ways truly were dying, but she said she could not be part of this new world. She requested exile rather than submission, and the queen, showing wisdom I was beginning to deeply respect, granted it. Red Talon and those who still followed her, maybe 50 harpies in total, left the spire that day. I watched them fly away toward distant peaks, and wondered what would become of them. In the aftermath, the queen instituted changes. She established a council that included not just clan leaders, but also scholars, and surprisingly, 2 of the human captives who had shown leadership among the men. She declared that while the breeding program would continue, it would no longer be purely forced. Harpies and humans who wished to participate could do so voluntarily, and those who didn't would be given other roles in the new society being built. She announced that she was preparing an envoy to make contact with human authorities, to explain the situation and seek cooperation rather than conflict, and she made it clear that I, as the father of the first hybrid child, and as an advisor she'd come to value, would be part of that envoy. I stood at the edge of the great opening, looking out at the world below, and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 months ago, I'd been a warehouse worker with no particular ambitions, living a simple life that I'd been reasonably content with. Now I was something else entirely. Father to a half-harpy child, advisor to a desperate queen, bridge between species that had no reason to trust each other. The weight of it was crushing and exhilarating in equal measure. Kestrel landed beside me, her bronze wings folding neatly against her back. She asked if I was afraid of what came next. I told her I was terrified. She made that sound that might have been laughter, and said that was probably the appropriate response. She asked if I thought humans would accept what had happened here, if there was really a chance for cooperation. I told her honestly that I didn't know. Humans were complicated. Some would see the Harpies as victims of a curse who deserved help. Others would see them as monsters who had kidnapped and exploited human men. It would depend on who we talked to, how we presented our case, and how lucky we got. The Queen approached, her massive form casting a shadow that engulfed us both. She said the envoy would leave in 7 days, as soon as Stormbringer was deemed healthy enough for his mother to leave him in the care of the nursery attendants. I would go, as would Razorwing, to show what interspecies cooperation could produce, along with 3 scholars, 2 warriors for protection, and one of the human council members, a man named Marcus, who had been a lawyer before his capture, and who understood how to negotiate. We would fly to the nearest city, request an audience with authorities, and hope we weren't shot down before we could explain ourselves. It was a desperate plan, full of ways it could go catastrophically wrong, but it was better than the alternative of waiting for humans to find the spire and reacting with military force. I looked at the Queen and asked what would happen if the envoy failed, if humans refused to help or demanded things the Harpies couldn't accept. She met my gaze with those silver eyes and said something that chilled me. Then we find other mountains, other caves, and we teach our daughters to hide better than their mothers did, and we hope that Stormbringer and others like him grow strong enough to survive what comes next. It was a non-answer that revealed everything about how precarious this situation really was. The Harpies were balanced on a knife's edge between survival and extinction, between war and peace, and I was somehow crucial to which way they would fall. That night, I was allowed to visit the nursery again. Stormbringer slept in a nest of soft materials, watched over by attendants who sang to him constantly. I watched his tiny chest rise and fall, and wondered what kind of life he would have. Would he grow up in a world where Harpies and humans had found a way to coexist? Or would he be hidden away in mountain peaks, part of a dying species that refused to die quietly? Would he resent his human heritage, or embrace it? Would he ever meet my family, my parents who by now surely thought I was dead? The questions were endless and unanswerable, so I just stood there and watched him sleep, and tried to memorize his face in case everything went wrong, and I never saw him again. Kestrel found me there, and asked if I wanted to learn to fly. I thought she was joking, until she explained that part of the envoy plan involved me being able to travel under my own power, rather than being carried like cargo. The scholars had been working on a harness system, something using the same lightweight metals they used for their weapons, combined with specially designed wings made from stretched leather and bone. It wouldn't make me truly capable of flight like a harpy, but with practice and help from the wind currents around the spire, I could learn to glide and maneuver enough to keep up with the group. The idea was terrifying and thrilling. I'd watched harpies fly with envy and fear in equal measure. The thought of joining them, even artificially, seemed impossible. The next days were spent in brutal training. The harness chafed and cut into my shoulders and waist despite padding. The wings were heavier than they looked, and required strength I hadn't known I possessed to control. I fell more times than I could count, saved from serious injury by safety ropes and alert harpy spotters. But slowly, painfully, I began to understand the basics. How to read the wind, how to angle the wings to catch lift, how to shift my weight for turns. I would never be graceful like a natural harpy, but I was becoming functional, and that was enough. The scholars monitoring my progress seemed pleased, discussing in rapid-fire harpy language about how this proved human adaptability, how with the right tools, the gap between species could be bridged literally as well as figuratively. On the 6th day, disaster struck. Scouts reported that the human search parties had found something, a piece of torn clothing, mine I assumed, that had been dropped during my initial capture. They were following the trail, using dogs and helicopters and determination. They would be at the mountain's base within days. The timeline for the envoy accelerated dramatically. We would leave at dawn the next day, ready or not, and fly directly to meet the searchers before they could mobilize a larger response. It was risky in every possible way, but the Queen decided it was better than the alternative of letting humans discover the spire on their own terms. That final night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my chamber thinking about everything that had led to this moment. 3 months ago, I'd been nobody, going nowhere, living a life of quiet desperation that I'd convinced myself was contentment. Now I was about to represent an entire species in negotiations that could determine the fate of thousands. I thought about Sarah, wondered if she'd moved on, if she even remembered me. I thought about my parents, about the grief they must be feeling. I thought about Stormbringer and all the other children that might be born from this desperate gamble. I thought about the Harpies, these fierce and frightening and ultimately sympathetic beings who had chosen survival over pride. And I thought about myself, about who I'd become in captivity, about whether I was strong enough for what came next. Dawn arrived too quickly. The envoy assembled at the great opening, Razorwing looking fierce and maternal simultaneously, Marcus the lawyer with terror and determination written on his face, the 3 scholars whose names I'd finally learned, the 2 warriors who radiated barely controlled violence, Kestrel who had insisted on joining as my personal guard, and me with my artificial wings strapped to my back and my heart hammering in my chest. The Queen gave a speech I only half understood about honor and courage, and the future of all Harpies. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against mine. A gesture I'd learned was one of deep respect among their kind. She said in halting human language that I had proven myself worthy of the trust placed in me, and that whatever happened next, the Harpies would remember that a human had stood with them when he could have broken. We launched into the sky as the sun broke over the mountains, 8 figures against the dawn. The flight was nothing like my training runs. We moved fast, taking advantage of strong morning thermals that carried us down from the peaks toward the lowlands. My artificial wings screamed in the wind, and my muscles burned within minutes, but I kept pace. Below us, the landscape transformed from stone to forest to farmland. In the distance, I could see vehicles, tiny from this height, and the glint of sunlight on metal that might have been helicopters. The searchers, our destination, our last hope or our doom, depending on how the next hours went. Razorwing carried Stormbringer in a specially designed sling, and as we flew, I saw her adjust it constantly, protective and fierce. Marcus flew supported by one of the warriors, lacking even my artificial wings. The scholars flew in formation, their gray feathers making them look like living storm clouds. Kestrel stayed close to me, ready to catch me if my wings failed or my strength gave out. We were a strange group, broken and desperate, and somehow magnificent, racing toward an encounter that would change everything. As we descended toward the searchers, I saw people pointing up at us, saw vehicles stopping, saw the helicopters changing course to intercept. This was it, the moment where everything either came together or fell apart. I thought about the Queen's words about finding other mountains if this failed, and I realized that failure wasn't acceptable. Too many people, human and Harpy alike, were depending on this working. So when we landed, when soldiers rushed forward with weapons raised and officials shouted demands for explanation, I stepped forward with artificial wings spread wide and Stormbringer's tiny cries echoing behind me, and I began to speak. I told them everything, about the curse and the prophecy and the desperate species clinging to survival in their mountain fortress, about the men who'd been taken and the reasons why, about the child who represented hope and terror in equal measure, about the choice we all face between cooperation and conflict, between understanding and war. And as I spoke, with Harpies flanking me and human authorities staring in disbelief, I realized that my old life was truly gone. There was no going back to being a warehouse worker with simple dreams and uncomplicated days. I was something new now, something that didn't quite fit in either world, but somehow bridged them both. The officials were talking rapidly among themselves, some looking at Stormbringer with wonder, others looking at the Harpy warriors with fear. Marcus stepped forward and began speaking in his lawyer voice about international law and endangered species and diplomatic immunity and a dozen other things I didn't fully understand, but that seemed to be having an effect. The scholars spread out documents they'd brought, ancient texts and prophecies and genetic charts, trying to prove their case with evidence and passion. Hours passed with negotiations and arguments, and moments where everything seemed about to collapse. But slowly, impossibly, a framework began to emerge: temporary asylum for the Spire, while a proper investigation was conducted, medical examination for the captured men, to ensure they hadn't been harmed beyond the initial kidnapping, genetic testing for Stormbringer to understand the implications of hybrid offspring, talks about establishing a protected zone around the Spire, about potential breeding programs supervised by international organizations, about education and integration, and 1,000 other details that would take years to work out if they worked out at all. As the sun set on that impossible day, I stood between worlds and wondered what came next. The Queen had given me a choice before we left, whispered in the private moment before we launched. She said that if the negotiations went well, I could request to be returned to my old life, that they would honor my service by letting me go, or I could choose to stay, to continue being the bridge, to raise Stormbringer and any other children who came after, to help build something new from the ruins of 2 isolated species. She said the choice was mine alone to make, and that either way, she would understand. I looked at Razorwing holding our son, at Kestrel standing guard with fierce loyalty, at Marcus who had found purpose in his captivity, at the scholars who had placed their hope in an experiment that had actually worked, at the human officials who were trying to process the impossible situation they'd been thrown into. And I realized that the choice had been made long ago, probably the first time Stormbringer looked at me with those knowing eyes. I couldn't go back. There was no back to go to. There was only forward, into uncertainty and danger, and possibility. The lead official, a woman with gray hair and sharp eyes who'd introduced herself as Director Chen, from some government agency I'd never heard of, asked me directly what I wanted to happen. She said my testimony would carry weight, that as the first human to successfully integrate with the Harpy society, my perspective mattered. I thought about all the things I could say, all the ways I could spin this to serve different agendas, but in the end, I just told the truth. I said that 3 months ago I would have told you these creatures were monsters, who should be destroyed or contained. Now, I understood they were people, different and frightening, but ultimately just trying to survive like anyone else. I said that we had a chance here to prevent an extinction, to build something unprecedented, to prove that even vastly different species could find common ground when faced with no other choice. I said it wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be clean, and there would be setbacks, and conflicts, and moments where everyone questioned if it was worth it. But I said the alternative, letting an entire sentient species die out because we were too afraid or too proud to help, was something I couldn't live with. Director Chen studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. She said she would recommend to her superiors that they proceed with a provisional agreement, that the Spire would be granted protected status, while longer-term solutions were negotiated. She said it would be controversial, that there would be opposition from people who saw the Harpies as threats, or who objected to the methods they'd used to survive. She said I should prepare for scrutiny, for media attention, for people calling me everything from hero to traitor to Stockholm Syndrome victim. She said my life would never be simple again. I almost laughed because my life hadn't been simple since the moment talons pierced my shoulders and ripped me from the earth. As darkness fell, we made camp there on the edge of the forest, Harpies and humans together in an uneasy truce overseen by soldiers who didn't quite know what to make of any of this. Stormbringer cried, and was fed by Razorwing using methods I tried not to watch too closely. Marcus sat with some of the other freed men who'd been brought from the searchers' camp, comparing stories and trying to process their trauma. Kestrel perched on a boulder nearby, her eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, unable to fully relax even though no immediate danger threatened. The scholars huddled together, speaking in rapid Harpy language about the day's events and what they meant for the future. I sat apart from everyone, my artificial wings finally removed, and my shoulders aching from hours of strain, and tried to understand what my life had become. Director Chen approached and sat beside me without asking permission. She said that she'd been briefed on the situation, that she knew I hadn't chosen this, that I was as much a victim as anyone. She asked if I was really okay with staying, with being part of this experiment, or if I was just too traumatized to see that I had other options. I appreciated the concern even as I rejected it. I told her that yes, I was traumatized. Yes, I was scared. Yes, part of me wanted to run back to my old life and pretend none of this had happened. But I also told her that running wasn't actually an option, because Stormbringer existed and needed a father, because the Harpies needed someone who understood both worlds, because I'd discovered something in myself during these months that I'd never known was there. The ability to matter, to make a difference, to be part of something bigger than my own small existence. She accepted that, though I could tell she didn't entirely understand it. Maybe she thought I was deluded or broken. Maybe she was right, but it was my delusion, my brokenness, and I owned it completely. She said the government would be in touch, that there would be debriefings and medical examinations and legal proceedings about the kidnappings. She said some of the men would probably file charges, that there could be prosecutions, even if the Harpies claimed necessity as a defense. She said it was going to be messy and complicated and take years to sort out, if it ever got sorted out at all. I told her I understood, and that I'd cooperate with whatever was needed. She nodded, then surprised me by putting a hand on my shoulder and saying that she admired what I was trying to do, even if she thought I was probably insane for doing it. The night deepened, and people gradually fell asleep around the fires that had been built. I lay on the ground staring up at stars that seemed closer than they'd ever been before, and listened to the sounds of two species learning to share space: human snores and Harpy wing rustling, soldiers moving on patrol, and scouts taking flight for night watch, Stormbringer's tiny whimpers and Razorwing's soothing sounds. It was wrong and awkward and probably shouldn't work, but it was working, at least for now, at least enough to give hope that maybe it could continue working. Kestra landed beside me silently, her bronze feathers almost invisible in the darkness. She asked in a whisper if I regretted anything. I told her I regretted that it had happened this way, with violence and fear and coercion. But I didn't regret where I'd ended up, or the choices I'd made once I understood the full situation. She made a sound of understanding, then asked something that surprised me. If I thought humans and Harpies could ever truly be equals, rather than one side dominating the other. I thought about it carefully before answering. I said that equality was probably the wrong goal, that the two species were too different for true equality to exist, but partnership, cooperation, mutual benefit, those were achievable if both sides wanted them badly enough. She seemed satisfied with that answer, or at least willing to accept it. The dawn came gray and cold, mist rising from the forest floor as everyone stirred. Director Chen had received instructions overnight via satellite phone. We would all fly back to the spire, humans and Harpies together, for a formal inspection by government representatives. It was a massive show of trust on both sides. The Harpies would be opening their home to potential enemies. The humans would be flying into a fortress full of creatures who could kill them in seconds if things went wrong. But it was necessary if there was any hope of moving forward. The soldiers looked unhappy about it, but followed orders. Marcus looked terrified but determined. The scholars looked excited, finally getting validation for their years of study and faith in the prophecy. We launched at mid-morning, a much larger group now, with human officials being carried by Harpy volunteers and soldiers clinging nervously to safety harnesses. The flight back to the spire took longer because we traveled at human pace rather than Harpy speed. It gave me time to think about what the inspection would reveal, what judgments would be made. The spire was beautiful, but also brutal, a place where survival had required harsh choices. Would the inspectors see a desperate species doing what was necessary, or would they see a threat that needed to be contained or eliminated? Everything depended on perspective, and perspective could be changed by context and explanation. As we approached the mountains, I saw Harpies streaming out from the spire in numbers I'd never seen before. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, filling the sky in a display that was clearly meant to impress and intimidate. The Queen had positioned her forces perfectly, showing strength without threatening attack, demonstrating capability without hostility. We landed in the great amphitheater to find it prepared like a throne room, with the Queen presiding from her platform and clan leaders arrayed in formal positions. The human officials were clearly overwhelmed, but trying to maintain professional composure. Director Chen stepped forward and through a translator, formally requested permission to inspect the spire on behalf of the human governments who had an interest in the situation. The Queen granted permission with elaborate ceremony that I was learning was standard for important decisions. Then something unexpected happened. She called me forward and spoke in halting human language so everyone could understand. She said that I had proven myself to be more than just a victim or a tool, that I had become a voice for both species, and that she was formally appointing me as liaison between Harpies and humans, with full authority to speak on behalf of the Spire in matters relating to integration and cooperation. It was a title I hadn't asked for, responsibilities I wasn't sure I wanted, but as I looked around at faces both human and Harpy, watching me expectantly, I realized refusing wasn't an option. I accepted with words I hoped sounded more confident than I felt. The inspection lasted 3 days. Human officials examined everything from the nursery levels to the forges, from the agriculture chambers to the schools. They interviewed Harpies of all castes and ages. They examined Stormbringer extensively, taking measurements and samples that Razorwing allowed, only because I asked her to trust the process. They spoke with all the captured men, documenting their experiences and assessing their physical and mental states. Some of the men were severely traumatized and would need extensive therapy. Others had adapted in unexpected ways, finding purpose or even contentment in their new roles. A few, like Marcus, had become genuine believers in the cause, understanding the desperate circumstances that had led to their capture, even if they couldn't entirely forgive the methods. On the third night, Director Chen and her team presented their preliminary findings to an assembly of both species. The report was balanced but didn't shy away from hard truths. Yes, the Harpies had committed serious crimes by human standards, kidnapping and coercing men into reproductive service. But yes, they were also a sentient species facing imminent extinction with no other viable options. The report recommended a complex solution. The captured men would be given full choice about whether to return home or remain at the Spire, with psychological support and compensation, regardless of their decision. The Harpy breeding program would continue, but only with consenting participants, likely requiring a recruitment effort among human volunteers who understood the circumstances. The Spire would be established as a protected zone with international oversight. Hybrid children would be granted full legal status in both human and Harpy societies. And most importantly, an ongoing dialogue would be established to address issues as they arose, with me serving as primary liaison until such time as more formal structures could be built. It wasn't perfect. Both sides had objections. Some Harpies felt the oversight was an invasion of their sovereignty. Some humans felt the punishments for the kidnappings were insufficient. But it was workable, a foundation that could be built upon if everyone involved was willing to compromise. The vote to accept the framework came down to a single Harpy clan leader who'd been undecided. She asked to see Stormbringer one more time before casting her vote. Razorwing brought him forward, and the clan leader studied him for a long moment. Then she spoke in their language, and the translator said, "He has his father's eyes and his mother's wings. He is proof that adaptation is not corruption, but evolution. I vote to accept." The Spire erupted in sound. Cheers from some, hisses of discontent from others, but overall acceptance that this was the path forward. The human officials looked relieved and exhausted. I felt like I'd been carrying a mountain on my shoulders and someone had finally lifted half the weight. It wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning, but we'd cleared the first impossible hurdle. Two species that had every reason to be enemies had chosen to try something different. In the days that followed, structures began forming. I moved between worlds constantly, spending mornings with human officials, learning legal frameworks and international protocols, afternoons with Harpy scholars learning their history and customs more deeply, evenings with Razorwing and Stormbringer trying to figure out what co-parenting looked like across species lines. It was exhausting and overwhelming and occasionally terrifying, but it was also meaningful in ways my old life had never been. I mattered now. My choices had consequences that rippled out to affect thousands of lives. It was a responsibility I hadn't wanted but couldn't imagine giving up. Stormbringer grew faster than human children, already showing signs of personality and preference. He liked heights, would cry if taken too far from windows or openings where he could see the sky. He responded to Harpy songs, but also to human lullabies I half remembered from my own childhood. His wings were developing properly according to the scholars, though they predicted he'd never fly with the grace of a full-blooded Harpy. He was something new, something unprecedented, and everyone who looked at him saw either hope or threat depending on their perspective. Razorwing remained distant with me, but fiercely protective of our son, making clear that while we were co-parents, we would never be partners in any romantic sense. I was fine with that. Whatever physical connection we'd had was purely functional, and neither of us desired more. Kestrel became my closest friend in the Spire, helping me navigate Harpy politics and social structures that were Byzantine in their complexity. She confided that she was curious about human males in ways that went beyond academic interest, that she wondered what it would be like to choose a partner based on attraction rather than breeding requirements. I introduced her to Marcus, who decided to stay at the Spire and work on legal frameworks for the new hybrid society. Watching them navigate cultural differences while trying to communicate romantic interest would have been funny if it wasn't so genuinely touching. They were building something new too, in their own small way. The first human volunteers arrived on the 70th day after the inspection. 7 men who'd heard about the situation and decided they wanted to help. They came from different backgrounds. Scientists curious about cross-species genetics, adventurers seeking novelty, lonely men hoping for purpose, idealists who believed in the cause. They underwent extensive screening by both human and Harpy authorities before being accepted. I met with each of them personally, trying to explain what they were really signing up for, the reality versus the romantic notion. Some backed out after those conversations. Others doubled down, committed to trying. The ones who stayed were paired with Harpy females who'd volunteered, and the process began again, this time with consent and support, rather than coercion and fear. Sarah contacted me through official channels. She'd seen the news coverage, had recognized me in footage from the Spire despite my changed appearance. I'd lost weight and gained scars and wore my hair longer now. She wanted to talk. We arranged a video call supervised by both sides, awkward and painful, as we tried to find words for a situation that had no precedent. She said she'd thought I was dead, had mourned me, had started moving on. Now she didn't know what to think. I told her I understood, that I was sorry for what my disappearance had put her through, but that I was committed to my role here and couldn't come home. She cried. I almost cried. We said goodbye, knowing we'd probably never speak again. It hurt, but it was a necessary cut, severing the last real tie to my old life. My family was harder. My mother broke down on video call, sobbing with relief that I was alive mixed with horror at what I'd been through. My father looked older, gray hair and lined face showing the stress of my disappearance. My brother, always the pragmatist, asked detailed questions about the situation, trying to understand from a practical standpoint. I told them everything I could, showed them Stormbringer, explained why I was staying. Mom begged me to come home. Dad said he supported whatever decision I made. My brother said I'd always been the weird one, and this was just taking it to an extreme. We ended the call with no resolution, just a promise to stay in contact as much as possible. They didn't understand, couldn't understand really, but they were trying, and that was more than I had any right to expect. Months passed in a blur of activity. More hybrid children were born, each one unique, each one monitored closely by scientists and scholars from both species. The genetics were fascinating and unpredictable. Some children leaned heavily Harpy in appearance and ability. Others were nearly human with only vestigial wings and slight features. All were healthy. All were growing properly. All represented hope for Harpy survival. The traditional Harpies who'd opposed the program grew quieter as results proved the prophecy correct. There were still holdouts like Red Talon, living in exile in distant peaks, refusing to accept change, but they were becoming irrelevant as the majority embraced the new reality. I traveled to human cities as part of diplomatic missions, explaining the situation to governments and organizations, advocating for resources and support. Some people saw me as a hero, others as a traitor or a victim suffering from Stockholm Syndrome. I learned to ignore both extremes and focus on the work. Media coverage was intense and often hostile. Tabloids ran sensational stories about bird women stealing men for breeding programs. Serious journalists questioned the ethics of the entire arrangement. Politicians used the situation to score points on various sides of various arguments. Through it all, I kept returning to the Spire, to Stormbringer and the other children, to the work of building bridges that shouldn't exist but did. On the 1-year anniversary of my capture, the Queen held a ceremony honoring those who'd contributed to the successful transition. I was given a Harpy name, something that translated roughly to Bridgewalker, and formal status as a member of the Spire community. It was strange and touching and deeply weird to be honored for adapting to my own kidnapping, but I understood the significance from the Harpy perspective. I represented change, adaptation, the willingness to evolve rather than die. In their culture, those were the highest virtues. Stormbringer took his first flight that day. He was still small, his wings not fully developed, but with help from his mother and encouragement from me standing on a platform below, He launched himself into the air and glided for maybe 30 seconds before Razorwing caught him. The pride on her face was unmistakable, and in that moment, I saw her not as an alien creature, but as a mother celebrating her child's achievement. It reminded me that for all our differences, some things were universal. Later, when Stormbringer landed in my arms, chirping excitedly and flapping his small wings, I felt something I hadn't expected. Complete acceptance of this impossible life. This was real. This was mine. This was worth protecting. But challenges kept coming. A faction of human activists declared the entire arrangement immoral, staging protests outside government buildings and calling for the spire to be shut down, and the Harpies relocated to reservations under human control. Some conservative Harpy clans declared that too much integration was diluting their culture, that they were losing their identity in the rush to survive. Young Harpies who'd been raised with the new system sometimes clashed with traditional elders about proper behaviors and protocols. Hybrid children faced identity issues as they grew, belonging fully to neither species. Marcus and Kestrel's relationship became controversial when they announced she was pregnant, making their child the first to be conceived through genuine romantic partnership rather than arranged breeding. Every breakthrough brought new complications. Every solution created new problems. I spent less time in direct diplomacy and more time in education, working with both species to create shared understanding. Human children visited the spire on school trips, learning about Harpy culture and biology. Young Harpies flew to human cities for cultural exchanges. We established a formal school at the spire where hybrid children could learn about both their heritages. Language barriers gradually eroded as more Harpies learned human tongues, and more humans learned basic Harpy communication. It was slow, frustrating work that produced incremental progress, rather than dramatic breakthroughs. But incremental progress was still progress. Stormbringer at age 2 was already showing remarkable abilities. He could glide effectively, if not gracefully, could speak simple words in both English and the Harpy language, understood concepts that should have been beyond his development level. The scientists were fascinated, constantly wanting to study him, and I had to fight to ensure he had something resembling a normal childhood, despite being a living experiment. Razorwing and I disagreed frequently about parenting approaches. She wanted him raised primarily in Harpy tradition. I wanted him to understand his human heritage equally. We compromised messily, both of us learning as we went. Neither of us entirely satisfied, but both committed to his well-being above our own preferences. The Queen grew older visibly, the weight of leadership during such dramatic change taking its toll. She confided in me once that she worried she wouldn't live to see the full results of the choices she'd made, that she'd die not knowing if she'd saved her species or hastened its end in a different form. I told her that no one ever knew the long-term results of their choices, that all we could do was make the best decisions possible with available information and hope future generations forgave our mistakes. She seemed comforted by that, or at least resigned to the uncertainty. New threats emerged from unexpected directions. Human criminal organizations saw opportunities in the situation, kidnapping hybrid children for ransom, trying to steal Harpy eggs for black market sales, attempting to establish unauthorized breeding programs for profit. Harpy extremists attacked human settlements that they felt were encroaching on traditional territories. Each incident required careful management to prevent spiraling into larger conflict. My role expanded to include crisis response, rushing between incidents trying to mediate before violence escalated. It was exhausting and endless, and I started to understand why the Queen looked so tired. Yet there were moments of profound hope mixed with the challenges. I witnessed the first fully consensual bonding ceremony between a human man and a Harpy woman who'd genuinely fallen in love despite the species barrier. I saw hybrid children playing together, inventing games that combined flight and running in ways neither pure species could achieve. I attended the graduation of the first mixed species class from the Spire Academy, young people who'd grown up with integration as their normal and couldn't imagine the separation that had existed before. These moments sustained me through the darker times, reminding me why the struggle mattered. Stormbringer asked me once why I stayed, why I didn't go back to the human world where everything would be easier. He was 4 years old, but spoke and reasoned like a human child twice that age. I told him the truth, that I stayed because he existed, because his future depended on humans and Harpies learning to coexist, because running away from hard things wasn't the kind of example I wanted to set for my son. He thought about that for a while with his 2 knowing eyes, then asked if I was happy. I realized I didn't know how to answer. Happy wasn't the right word. Fulfilled, maybe. Purposeful. scared and tired and frequently overwhelmed, but also more alive than I'd ever been in my comfortable, meaningless old life. I told him I was happy enough, and that seemed to satisfy him. Director Chen visited on the 5-year anniversary of first contact. She'd been promoted, now overseeing entire human-harpy relations rather than just the initial crisis. She brought news that the framework we'd established was being used as a model for other scenarios where humanity encountered non-human intelligence. She said what we'd built here, messy and imperfect as it was, had implications far beyond just saving one species from extinction. She said I should be proud. I told her pride felt premature when so much was still uncertain, when the long-term stability of the arrangement was far from guaranteed. She smiled sadly and said that uncertainty was the nature of pioneering work, that no one ever knew if they were building something lasting or just delaying the inevitable. That night, I stood at the edge of the great opening, as I'd done so many times before, watching the sun set over the mountains. Stormbringer joined me, his wings now large enough that he could fly short distances independently. We stood in comfortable silence, father and son, human and hybrid, products of impossible circumstances who'd somehow made a life from trauma and necessity. He asked what I was thinking about. I told him I was thinking about beginnings and endings, about how sometimes you couldn't tell which was which until long after they'd passed. He said that seemed complicated. I agreed and pulled him closer, feeling his feathers against my arm. Still strange even after 5 years, but also familiar in the way the deeply weird becomes when you live with it long enough. Behind us, the spire hummed with life, harpy calls mixing with human voices, hybrid children playing games that combined elements of both species, the constant background sound of wings in motion. It was chaotic and imperfect, and sometimes barely functional, but it was surviving, and that was more than anyone had expected when I'd first been torn from my ordinary life and thrust into the extraordinary. I thought about the Queen's question from years ago, whether I'd choose to stay or return home if given the option. The answer was clearer now than it had been then. There was no returning, because home had shifted, had become this place where nothing made sense, except that it worked just enough to keep going. Stormbringer spread his wings and launched himself into the evening air, swooping and calling in a voice that was neither human nor harpy, but something new. I watched him with emotions I couldn't name, pride and fear and hope tangled together. He represented a future I never could have imagined, one where species barriers were bridges rather than walls, where difference was strength rather than division. It was idealistic and probably naive, and there were 1,000 ways it could all still fall apart. But standing there in the fading light, watching my impossible sun fly against an impossible sky, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we were building something that could last. Something that future generations, both human and harpy and hybrid, might look back on and say, this is where it began. This is where everything changed. This is where 2 species chose survival together over extinction apart. And in the distance, carried on the wind that sang through the mountain peaks, I heard the Queen's voice raised in the evening call, a sound that had been made by her ancestors for millennia and would hopefully continue long after she was gone. I added my own voice to it, human words with harpy cadence, building a harmony that shouldn't exist, but did. Stormbringer circled back and joined us, his voice the bridge between both, and for that moment, everything felt possible. The future remained uncertain, the challenges remained immense, but we faced them together, and that made all the difference between hopeless and hopeful. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of coming rain, and I knew that tomorrow would bring new problems, new conflicts to mediate, new crises to resolve. But tomorrow was tomorrow. Tonight, I was here, part of something larger than myself, father to a child who represented hope for thousands, bridge between worlds that had no reason to trust each other, but were learning anyway. It wasn't the life I'd planned, it wasn't the life I'd wanted, but standing there between earth and sky, between human and harpy, between what was and what might be, I realized it was the life I needed, the life that needed me, and maybe that was enough. The question of whether we would succeed or fail, whether this fragile piece would hold or shatter, whether Stormbringer and all the hybrid children would have a real future or just delay the inevitable, those questions remained unanswered, hanging in the air like Stormbringer himself, suspended between possibilities. And perhaps that uncertainty, that perpetual balance between hope and fear, survival and extinction, was exactly where we needed to be. Not comfortable, not secure, but alive and trying and refusing to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. The Harpy Queen had demanded I bear their future, and here I was, carrying it not in my genetics, but in my choices, my persistence, my stubborn belief that bridges could be built between any two peoples if both sides wanted them badly enough. Whether I was right remained to be seen, but I was committed now, too deep to turn back, too invested to imagine any other path. And as darkness fell completely and the stars emerged above the spire, I stood there between worlds and wondered what tomorrow would demand, knowing I would face it as I'd faced everything else these 5 years, with fear and courage in equal measure, with doubt and determination, with the knowledge that nothing was certain except that the trying itself mattered more than any guaranteed outcome ever could.